Everyone has heard about her, but no one has seen her true face. A wise ruler who knew how to build a fleet, suppress rebellion, mint money, and feed the hungry. Cleopatra is one of the most famous women who ever lived on Earth. She lost and won. She owned the entire Eastern Mediterranean, the last of the great Egyptian kingdoms. But what obstacles did she have to overcome on her life path? Why did she marry her own brothers? Who did she consider her sworn rival? And what fatal mistake cost her the life of her beloved and her own? You will learn about this and much more in today's video. You are watching Biographer History. Get comfortable and let's get started. To see Cleopatra as she really is, we'll need to clear her image of myths and gossip. None of the historians can be taken literally. Even modern scholars still argue about many circumstances of Cleopatra's life. It is not known who her mother was, how long she lived in Rome, how many times she was pregnant, whether Antony married her, how the battle that decided her fate ended, and how she died. The authors of the most reliable of her sources never saw Cleopatra. Most of the writers and historians who described her life were born later. The story of Cleopatra differs from the stories of other women in that the men who wrote it, for various reasons, were not entirely objective in their descriptions of her. The bond with Mark Antony was the longest in her life, but the bond with his enemy Octavian Augustus truly made her immortal. Augustus defeated Antony and Cleopatra, and to enhance the effect, introduced us to the tabloid version of the Egyptian queen. Voracious, bloodthirsty, and power-hungry. We know very little about Cleopatra, but she knew far from everything about herself. The queen had no idea that she was living in the first century of our era, in the era of Hellenism. The queen did not even know that she was Cleopatra VII, as she was used to considering herself the sixth. Her ancestors, the Ptolemies, were fabulously rich. They were the descendants of pharaohs whose country they inherited. The Ptolemies came from Macedonia, which gave the world Alexander the Great. A few months after Alexander's death, Ptolemy, the most determined of his military leaders, a childhood friend and, according to some sources, a distant relative, claimed the right to the Egyptian throne. Ptolemy's son stole Alexander's body while it was being taken to Greece. Alexander's golden sarcophagus became a relic and a talisman for the city. During Cleopatra's childhood, the sarcophagus was replaced with an alabaster or glass one. The treasury was empty, and the queen's great-grandfather sold the original to raise an army. This substitution cost him his life. The legitimacy of the Ptolemaic dynasty was ensured for a long time by its kinship with the most famous king of the ancient world, whom everyone, without exception, aspired to be like. The Ptolemies really came from the Macedonian aristocracy. Outside of Egypt, they were associated mainly with Alexander the Great, but in order to prove their claim to the throne, they needed at least some kinship with the pharaohs. Marriages between brothers and sisters were encouraged in the family, which was considered an ancient Egyptian custom. Among the Macedonians, it was customary to kill close relatives rather than marry them. The Ptolemies brought the ancient tradition to the point of absurdity. Of the 12 marriages in their family, 10 were between brothers and sisters. The other 2 were married to cousins. The custom of marrying sisters had a very practical meaning. Internal unions minimized the number of claimants to the throne and greatly simplified the order of inheritance. Besides, there was no need to look for a worthy wife in foreign lands. A peculiar matrimonial practice did not lead to the physical degeneration of the family, but ultimately confused the genealogy. If Cleopatra's parents were siblings, and most likely they were, then she had only one grandfather and one grandmother. This couple was, among other things, uncle and niece. Cleopatra's grandmother married her uncle. The inheritance of the throne became a problem for the Ptolemies, which could often be solved only with the help of a dagger or poison. Internal marriages strengthened the power of the dynasty, but led to endless enmity among numerous relatives. Another consequence of intermarriage was that it allowed women to rule. Cleopatra's great-grandmothers, just like their husband brothers, knew their worth and fearlessly demanded what was rightfully theirs. Women in Egypt generally occupied an exceptional position. Long before the Ptolemies, Egyptian women could choose their own husbands, inherit and independently manage their property. They had the right to divorce and be on the maintenance after it. In family conflicts, the law was on the side of wives and children. Almost a third of the Ptolemaic rulers were women. And what kind of women were they? Cleopatra's great-grandmother, for example, unleashed a civil war first against parents, then against children. Cleopatra's grandfather killed his wife and stepmother at the same time. Uncle did the same with his very young bride. Unfortunately, he did not take into account that the queen was much more popular among the people. The unfortunate king was torn to pieces by a mob on the 18th day of his reign. And do you like your relatives? Share with us in the comments. Thus, after 200 years of atrocities, in the 80th year BC, the Ptolemaic dynasty was interrupted. Because of the Roman threat, it was necessary to find a claimant to the throne as soon as possible. It was decided to summon Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, who fled to Syria 23 years before. To confirm his divine status and kinship with Alexander the Great, the new king took the title New Dionysus. However, the Alexandrians called him either bastard or Auletes, that is, a flute player because of his love for music. He appeared to be a much weaker emperor than a musician, but this did not prevent him from committing crimes. However, Ptolemy killed not because he wanted to, but because he had to get rid of competitors. At least he did not have to deal with his own mother. She was not of royal blood. Nevertheless, Auletes had a harder time than most of his relatives. So Cleopatra was neither Egyptian nor a descendant of the pharaohs. She was hardly related to Alexander the Great. Furthermore, in reality, she could not consider herself the great-grandmother of the Ptolemies, although she fully embodied all the best and worst features of a Macedonian aristocrat. Her sonorous name was undoubtedly Macedonian. Cleopatra, translated from ancient Greek, means glory of the family. Perhaps our Cleopatra was not the seventh at all. It was easy to lose track of a painful family history. Cleopatra, born in 69 BC, was the middle of three sisters. They were followed by two brothers. We can only guess about the fate of Cleopatra's mother. She disappeared from the sight of historians when her daughter was very young, and by the time Cleopatra was 12, she was most likely already dead. Nevertheless, the mother was much younger than her husband, either her brother or half-brother. They were married as soon as Auletes ascended the throne. Auletes, however, was much more interested in art than in politics, and although he ruled for 22 years, he went down in history as a pharaoh who loved to play the flute. Almost nothing is known about Cleopatra's childhood. She was born in the royal palace of Alexandria and was cared for by a wet nurse in her early years. Not a single dish was placed on her table until it had been tested for poison. The companions of the young princess in the games were children from noble families, the so-called named brothers and sisters, who were raised as future courtiers from an early age. From childhood, Cleopatra got used to the presence of politicians, scientists, and foreign ambassadors in her environment, and she played with terracotta dolls, doll houses, and dishes, and perhaps imagined herself as a commander on the battlefield. Since at that time the eldest child received the throne regardless of gender, it was Cleopatra who was being prepared for the kingdom together with her older sister. As a girl, she often traveled to Memphis, to the royal palace on the banks of the Nile, to participate in lavish and extravagant rituals, family celebrations, and processions. The young princess had the opportunity to get the best education in the entire Hellenistic world. The most famous scientists of that time were at her disposal, and the unique Alexandrian library was literally a stone's throw from her rooms. Cleopatra was taught by the most famous teachers and brilliant orators, and the most skilled doctors took care of her health. When Cleopatra was 9 or 10 years old, a Roman official who arrived at the court accidentally killed a cat, which was revered as a sacred animal in Egypt. The Auletes associate tried to calm the angry crowd under the walls of the palace. Different sources disagree on whether the Roman ambassador was saved. Such events could not fail to make an impression on little Cleopatra. But even without this, she had to feel anti-Roman sentiments in her country, caused by unprecedented cruelty, treachery, incompetence, and venality, which were characteristic of Roman politicians the last years of the Republic. The princess was undoubtedly more educated than her own father. Raised abroad in Asia Minor, but in general, she received a traditional Greek education, mostly in the humanities and almost the same as that of Caesar, who was raised by tutors from Alexandria. Cleopatra was taught to read Greek. A talented student quickly mastered the alphabet, which was followed by poems and myths, fables and proverbs, and later the basics of dramatic art. The princess could be asked to recite the monologue of the dying Achilles, or depict a scene from Euripides. Homer's Iliad is called Cleopatra's most favorite book. Studying was a serious issue, with lots of rules and cramming, and there were no days off. Classes were interrupted only during holidays, which fortunately were many in Alexandria. Apollo was honored twice a month, and life in the city practically stopped. Discipline was iron. Cleopatra tortured herself with endless lessons of her own free will. But hard efforts were not wasted. She became the first and only representative of the Ptolemaic family able to address her 7 million people in their native language. Unlike her ancestors, moreover, thanks to the acquired knowledge, Cleopatra could command the troops herself without resorting to the services of interpreters. Her beauty was not in itself altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her. However, whoever happened to be next to the queen and interacted with her could not resist her charms. The princess read poetry much more often than prose. Her favorite playwright was Euripides. Aeschylus and Sophocles, Pindar, Hesiod, and Sappho also made up Cleopatra's reading circle, like any other girl of blue blood. Though Cleopatra, like Caesar, had a rather vague idea about books being written in other languages. She even had to study the history of Egypt from 3 Greek texts. The basis of education was literature, but in addition to it, the girl was engaged in arithmetic, geometry, music, astrology, and astronomy. Cleopatra was not in the habit of reading silently. She usually recited at the top of her voice or listened to the readings of her mentors and servants. It was necessary to read aloud and with expression, correctly articulating and securing the effect with theatrical gestures. By the age of 14, the princess had fully mastered the art of rhetoric, which in the ancient world was valued no less than philosophy. Cleopatra learned to formulate her thoughts and express them clearly and elegantly, enlivening them with examples and vivid quotes. At that time, her father, Auletes, who had spent 20 years courting Rome, was bitterly surprised to find that this time would have been better spent pleasing his own citizens. Anxious moods arose in society, so the disappointed ruler fled to Rome, and it's assumed that Cleopatra followed her father. There, they spent the next 3 years looking for ways to return. In response, the Romans generously lent money to the Egyptian, and he willingly took it. Along with the number of Auletes' creditors, the number of those who were ready to facilitate his return to Egypt grew, but the task turned out to be not as simple as they would like. No sooner had the exiled ruler crossed the border than his eldest daughter, Berenice IV, seized the throne. She immediately faced a problem. She needed a male co-ruler, and among the noble Macedonians, there were no one worthy of the queen. For some reason, they decided not to marry her for her own brother, so in the end, the choice fell on the Persian prince. Berenice had no feelings for her future husband, except disgust, because, as they say, he was far from handsome by the standards of the time. He was strangled a few days after the wedding. The next contender was a Pontian priest who had 2 advantages. He was an enemy of Rome, and basically could pass for a person of noble origin. Ascending the throne in the spring of 56, the Pontian lasted longer than his predecessor. Meanwhile, the Alexandrians sent 100 messengers to Rome to tell the rulers there about the atrocities of Auletes and prevent his return. The Egyptian poisoned the head of the embassy and killed or lured to his side the rest of those who did not manage to escape. The murder was going to be investigated, but thanks to Auletes' famous generosity, the case was not allowed to proceed. Aules Gabinius, the Syrian proconsul and Ptolemy's protege, agreed to lead his campaign to his homeland. The legionnaires accompanying the king were the first Roman soldiers to set foot on Egyptian soil. The king executed Berenice, dealt with the unfaithful courtiers, not forgetting to confiscate their property, and disbanded the army, getting rid of traitorous commanders. At the same time, he generously endowed the legionnaires of Gabinius with land and gold. All of them swore allegiance to the Egyptian crown. After the overthrow of Berenice, the 13-year-old Cleopatra became the heir to the throne. By that time, she'd already achieved considerable success in the study of rhetoric, declamation, and philosophy. By the 56th year, the political education of the princess was completed, and very quickly the young woman had to use the acquired knowledge to help her father rule the country. Unlike many of her predecessors, including Auletes himself, she was preparing to reign from an early age. The king abandoned the custom of dividing the throne between brother and sister. Auletes died in his bed 5 years after his return. Apparently, father and daughter were very close because the princess added one more to her numerous titles, father-loving. Her brother did not have such an honor. Cleopatra's rise coincided with the period when Rome's influence extended to Egypt's borders. One Eastern monarch, who had begun his own epic struggle with Rome, had this to say about Cleopatra's future problems. The Romans are like wolves. They hate great kings and steal their property. It was a very transparent allusion to Egypt, the last rich country left in the East, which was part of the sphere of Romans' interests. This country knew how to be flexible, thanks to which it was mostly able to preserve its autonomy, but it was already strongly connected with Rome. And at such times, at the age of 18, Cleopatra became the sole ruler of her people. Even on the coins, which soon began to be minted by her order, there was only her portrait. Unfortunately, Cleopatra learned Berenice's lesson much worse. Plotinus, Achilles, and Theodotus, her younger brother's mentors, were not going to let her rule alone, but they were not the only ones who didn't like the queen. Among the Greco-Egyptian nobility in Alexandria, there were also many influential enemies of the queen. There were at least two reasons for this. First, Cleopatra pursued a pro-Roman policy that few liked. Secondly, the new ruler, unlike her half-brother, was of legal age and had her own will. Ptolemy, who was 8 years younger, could not prevent the nobility from making decisions on any issues. Cleopatra, on the other hand, was quite capable of doing everything without the regent's counsel, and even then, she didn't lack the necessary will and determination. Therefore, the military and politicians spoke against Cleopatra and in favor of her underage half-brother. The 51st year seemed hungry. The next was not much better. Cities and towns were deserted. Crowds of hungry people headed for Alexandria. A real disaster erupted. In October 1950, when it became clear that radical measures could not be dispensed with, the queen's brother took the stage. At the end of the month, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII signed a decree on seizing grain and vegetable stocks from the northerners due to famine. At the same time, honest workers who did not abandon their land received all kinds of benefits. Brother and sister had to act together to save the country. The problems did not end there. At the end of the year 50, two sons of the Syrian proconsul arrived in Alexandria to fetch the legionnaires who had come with Elides. However, the soldiers did not want to leave Egypt at all because they had already had their own land and families there. The legionnaires killed the sons of the proconsul, and Cleopatra did not judge the criminals herself and sent them to Syria in chains. Because of this gesture, the queen lost the army's support. And these were not all mistakes. So the next year, Pompey's son, who started a campaign against Caesar, turned to Cleopatra for help. The queen decided to share soldiers, ships, and grain with the Roman, although her country was not going through the best of times. In late spring, the high priest raised the queen and her brother to the throne. According to tradition, the ceremony took place in Memphis, the sacred capital of Egypt. Within the walls of the sanctuary, the bride and groom took oaths of fidelity to each other in the Egyptian language. Then Cleopatra was crowned with diadem. The brother and sister's marriage lasted 3 years. He was a teenager and was not considered mature, even according to the local concept of the time. But even then, he sought to make her vanish. The threat to her life and the usurpation of power by her brother and his supporters left the queen no choice but to flee to Syria and gather an army to regain her rightful throne. What is the difference between a country run by a woman and a country run by a man run by a woman? None. Throughout her life, Cleopatra watched as civil strife constantly broke out in Rome. They shook the entire Mediterranean, constantly forcing its inhabitants to change priorities and break old promises for the sake of new ones. Cleopatra's father once made a bet on the military leader Pompey the Great, who became the patron of his family. Pompey launched a war against Julius Caesar just when Cleopatra ascended the throne from the other side of the Mediterranean Sea. In early July, Cleopatra learned that the civil war in Rome was about to intersect with her own war against her brother. That was alarming news. For as long as she could remember, Egypt had existed under Roman patronage. However, both the queen and her treacherous brother Ptolemy XIII were in debt to Pompey. On the 28th of September, he landed on the Egyptian coast, pursued by Caesar. Pompey sought refuge and assumed that the young ruler, whose family owed him a lot, would not refuse help. However, it did not happen as expected. It was about 3 regents who actually ruled instead of the young Ptolemy: his mentor, Theodotus, the head of the royal guard, Achilles, and the eunuch Pothinus, who turned from the prince's tutor into his first minister. The sudden appearance of the Roman put all 3 in front of a difficult choice. Opinions were divided. To refuse Pompey meant to find a powerful enemy. To give him shelter meant to turn Caesar's wrath against themselves. Pompey did not have time to set foot on the shore. He was slaughtered right in the shallow water in front of the king dressed in purple, and his head was cut off when he was already dead. 3 days later, Julius Caesar, pursuing his rival, landed in Egypt. His army came with him. When Theodotus raised the head of the slain enemy to the Roman, Caesar turned pale with terror and could not hold back tears. Some of the tears may even have been sincere. After all, Pompey was once not just his ally, but also his son-in-law. He was enraged by this massacre and eventually buried Pompey's head near the walls of Alexandria, where he built a sanctuary of Nemesis. Alexandrians did not meet a Roman on the shore. For them, he was a usurper and a conqueror. In Rome, he managed to become a sole and unpopular ruler. Among other things, he imposed heavy taxes on the people. Alexandrians did not want to pay a foreign ruler and submit to Roman authority. Caesar settled in a house behind Ptolemy's palace in the eastern part of the city and immediately sent for reinforcements. And only then did he call the warring brother and sister to him. Cleopatra was then 21 years old. She was an orphan and in exile. Her court was located 200 miles from the palace. For a year, she had to be content with a tent in the desert. Months of desperate struggle for life were gone, fleeing across Middle Egypt, Palestine, and southern Syria. That summer, she gathered a squad of mercenaries, which cost her a fortune. Very close, near the sea fortress of Pelusium, on the east coast of Egypt, an army of 20,000 of mercenaries, pirates, criminals, exiles, and runaway slaves gathered under the command of 13-year-old Ptolemy. The sister encamped in the east of the fortress, in the middle of the steep waves of the sea. The queen's position was hopeless. And then Caesar appeared on the map. He considered it his duty to act as a peacemaker in this conflict because he once supported Auletes. Rome needed a peaceful, tax-paying Egypt. Caesar offered the brother and sister to reject stubbornness, forget about enmity, and no longer tempt fate. In other words, to save themselves and their people. Despite Caesar's call, Ptolemy did not think of leading his army anywhere. Breaking through to the west, to the sea and Pelusium was risky. According to one of the versions, the queen tried to contact Caesar with the help of an intermediary, but after learning that she was betrayed, she decided to appear before him herself. Actually, she did it hidden from prying eyes, so as not to be killed before reaching the shore. Interesting introduction, isn't it? How do you think Caesar was impressed by such a spectacular appearance? Write in the comments, and you will find out the answer later. The queen had to convince the Roman that she was always on his side. Caesar had no reason to believe the Egyptian. In his opinion, it was worth supporting a young ruler who had an army and the support of the Alexandrians. On the other hand, the death of Pompey was on Ptolemy's conscience. Caesar could assume that his countrymen would sooner forgive him for patronizing a dethroned queen than for an alliance with a Roman murderer. Also, the general's affection for Cleopatra was explained, at least at first, not by her unearthly beauty, but by the dislike that Caesar had for Ptolemy, and a completely justified mistrust of the group of regents. You can say that the queen was lucky. Having become the mistress of Julius Caesar, she decided to try to restore the Ptolemaic monarchy in all its former splendor. Later, Plutarch wrote about the personal qualities of the queen, who set herself a similar goal. They say she did not have that extraordinary beauty that immediately conquers people. However, it was difficult to resist her charm. The attractiveness of this woman was rooted in her personality, the ability to speak, and that special strength of spirit that manifested itself both in her speeches and in her actions, and she conquered those who communicated with her charm. They say that the very sound of her voice was mesmerizing. It is not known who actually seduced whom. Having seen her and heard her words, chosen, apparently with great care, Caesar was subdued. Cleopatra had never met a Roman general before and had no idea what to expect from him. She knew one thing for sure: in the most unfavorable course of events, it is better to be the handmaiden of Julius Caesar than her own brother. It follows from most sources that Cleopatra was able to quickly sway Caesar to her side, turning the judge into a defender. In fact, the seduction process might well have taken more than one night. Caesar offered Cleopatra to reconcile with her brother and rule the kingdom on equal terms with him. Ptolemy's advisors were certainly waiting for just that. However, for the young Ptolemy, her return was as much a surprise as it was for Caesar himself. He burst into tears and rushed out of the palace. Surrounded by courtiers and associates, he tore off the white ribbon from his head and threw it at his feet, crying that his sister had betrayed him. Caesar's bodyguards caught up with Ptolemy and brought him back to the palace, where he was placed under house arrest. Meanwhile, a mutiny was brewing in the city. The eunuch Pothinus called on the crowd to capture Cleopatra. If not for Caesar, the queen's brilliant reign would have ended before it had begun. The life of a commander taken by surprise could also end very sadly. Cleopatra did not inform her defender that she did not have the support of the capital residents, who preferred to see her brother on the throne. Alarmed, Caesar realized it was time to appear before the people. From a safe distance, most likely from a balcony or palace window, he promised the crowd to fulfill all their demands. When negotiations began, he managed to hide his true feelings and assured Ptolemy that he had come to Egypt with a mission of friendship and peace. Caesar achieved his goal. The Egyptian agreed to a truce. It was a small concession on the part of Ptolemy because he knew that his advisors would not stop the fight. While the negotiations were going on, troops were approaching Alexandria. Caesar arranged a magnificent ceremony where both brother and sister were present. There, both received the throne from the hands of Caesar. To demonstrate goodwill, he gave the island of Cyprus to the queen's brother and sister, 17-year-old Arsinoe, and 10-year-old Ptolemy XIV. For the Ptolemies, ownership of the island was a matter of principle. 10 years ago, Rome imposed exorbitant taxes on Cyprus. Its ruler, Cleopatra's uncle, preferred to drink the poison. The Romans took all his property and carried it through the streets of the city as a trophy. The older brother of the deceased, Cleopatra's father, silently endured the insult for which he was exiled by his own people. At that time, the princess was 11 years old. At the same time, Pothinus was stirring up discontent in the army. He convinced Achilles' men that the Roman was a liar. He divided the kingdom between his brother and sister, only to quell the rebels, and Caesar would give the crown to Cleopatra as soon as the opportunity arose. One of Caesar's servants overheard that Pothinus and Achilles were going to poison his master, and then finish with Cleopatra. Caesar ordered his man to kill the eunuch, which was eventually done. Meanwhile, Achilles did not want to stop the war. Caesar had 4,000 soldiers, while Achilles' army outnumbered him by 5. The Romans sent 2 messengers to the young king with an offer of peace, but Achilles killed them before they could deliver the message. Approaching the capital, he tried to attack Caesar's camp. Caesar was afraid of a siege and did not want to participate in an imposed battle. Most of all, the commander was worried about the water that was running out and the lack of food, because before his death, Pothinus filled the palace pantries with bitter grain. While the legionnaires were building fortifications and trying to arrange food transportation, the new rebellion broke out right in the palace. Arsinoe also had a eunuch teacher. He organized her escape. The people of Alexandria sided with Arsinoe and proclaimed her queen. After that, she joined Achilles and led the army. When news of the betrayal reached Cleopatra's chambers, she was once again convinced that it was better to trust a Roman than her own relatives. Caesar and Cleopatra survived the siege in as comfortable a condition as possible. However, the crowd continued to gather in the streets. Taunts and threats could be heard from behind the walls, and stones were thrown at the windows. Fierce clashes took place in the harbor, which the Alexandrians tried to cut off from the city. The rebels managed to burn several Roman ships. Courts borrowed by Pompey came in very handy there. A desperate struggle broke out. Caesar, who was waiting for reinforcements from day to day, could not allow the fleet to fall to the enemy, and the Romans set fire to their own ships. The flames engulfed the docks, causing panic. Taking advantage of this commotion, Caesar's men captured the Pharaoh's lighthouse. For this, the commander allowed them to rob the garrisons located on the rocky island. Meanwhile, the murder of the eunuch Pothinus shook the rebels. They began shelling the palace with slingshots, throwing stones and homemade projectiles at the walls. The battle continued, day and night. The streets were blocked by barricades, and the city turned into a military camp. The Egyptians even managed to establish a fleet in record time, which turned out to be twice as strong as the Roman one. The new military leader, Ganymede, ordered his men to dig deep trenches and pour seawater into the emptied water pipes. The palace suddenly lost drinking water. Caesar hastened to calm his men and ordered the soldiers to dig a well so they had drinking water. The Romans occupied the palace and the lighthouse in the east, and Ptolemy's general Achilles controlled the entire city, preventing the enemy from resupplying with provisions. When Caesar finally received reinforcements, despite fierce battles at sea and heavy casualties, he began to gradually turn the tide of the war. In mid-January, shortly after Cleopatra's 22nd birthday, parliamentarians came to the palace to ask for mercy for young Ptolemy. Caesar had long thought about letting the boy go. Now that the Alexandrians were ready to surrender, something had to be done with the failed king, and Caesar decided to talk to him. As a result, the Roman granted the young man his freedom, but Ptolemy made him promise that he would soon be allowed to return. Having found himself free, Ptolemy immediately resumed the war against the Romans. Fresh forces were already rushing to help Cleopatra and Caesar. The emperor of Judea brought 3,000 well-armed soldiers. Ptolemy and Caesar advanced to meet them at the same time, the one to join, the other to accept the battle. In this round, the victory went to Caesar, who made a brilliant maneuver by suddenly attacking the Egyptian camp at dawn. Caught by surprise, the Egyptians left the fortifications and ran away, trying to hide in the trenches. Some managed to escape, but Ptolemy, considering everything, perished. However, even his yesterday's advisors did not mourn the king's death. The commander at the head of his cavalry returned to Alexandria, where a belated reception awaited him, and finally presented Cleopatra with the Egyptian throne, because she always remained loyal to him. Caesar stayed with Cleopatra for several months, then left Egypt, taking the queen's sister Arsinoe with him, either as a captive or as a trophy. 12,000 legionnaires remained in Egypt to guard the mistress of their commander and the peace of the future Roman province. No one wanted a new uprising. In mid-June, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, half Roman, half Egyptian, half Ptolemaic, half Caesar, and from both lines, a descendant of the gods. Motherhood was very appropriate for the 22-year-old queen. In Cleopatra's view, the birth of this baby could do more for the country than the most sophisticated diplomatic games. Until then, the queen was too busy fighting for survival to think about the succession to the throne, but the appearance of her son gave hope that she would not die without leaving an heir. So, the great Ptolemaic dynasty would continue for centuries, especially since the firstborn turned out to be a boy. Caesar's son was her reliable protection and a guarantee of safety. The known awkwardness was that both were married to other people. During her pregnancy, Cleopatra managed to become a widow and remarry. Yes, you heard that right. To satisfy the expectations of the people who wanted to see a married couple on the throne and at the same time to cover Caesar's sins, 12-year-old Ptolemy XIV, who inherited the title of his late brother, was crowned. Coins with his portrait were not minted. The young king had any powerful ambitions, he understood that it was better to keep them to himself. Of course, he did not have the right to vote in state affairs. While Caesarion, that is, Little Caesar, this is how the Alexandrians nicknamed Ptolemy XV, was sitting on Cleopatra's lap, nothing threatened her throne. The child began to participate in public affairs before he had yet learned to speak. He actually dethroned his uncle. Cleopatra saw her purpose and honorable duty in feeding the people. The queen bore the title of Mistress of Prosperity for a reason, and although the economic system that existed at that time did not allow making large reserves, in bad years Cleopatra had no choice but to open the royal pantries. Furthermore, she held court, commanded the army and navy, solved economic problems, negotiated with neighboring states, supervised temples, set prices, drew up sowing schedules, distributed seeds, made sure that the canals were cleaned on time, and that the granaries did not lack grain. She was a judge, a high priestess, a queen, and a goddess. Sometimes, and each day more often, Cleopatra had to take on the duties of her own ministers. She led an army of secular and religious officials and was responsible for Egypt's political and trade relations with the outside world. The struggle for the interests of the state consumed almost all her time. Every day of my life begins with reading messages, receiving messengers from all over the country, and reports from officials on the current state of affairs. Then comes the decision-making time. Usually I dictate decrees to the scribes and sign them, sometimes using one name and sometimes putting under it, "So be it." Only after finishing urgent matters, I can take a bath and put myself in order. Cleopatra was very wealthy. Half of all that was produced and grown in Egypt was kept in the royal storehouses and treasuries. The queen's annual income was approximately 12,000 to 15,000 talents per year. For any monarch at that time, this was a truly astronomical sum. Of course, the wealth had to be shared with Rome, which ensured peace in Egypt. Less than a year after the birth of Caesarion, Cleopatra decided to go to Rome so that the father would recognize his son. Furthermore, the queen wanted to achieve confirmation of the Treaty of Alliance and friendship concluded by the Romans with her father 13 years ago. The new treaty, which was supposed to protect the queen from possible attempts to annex Egypt, was indeed concluded quickly and successfully. Since Caesar was then a full-fledged dictator, this was a great achievement for the queen, as a section of influential Romans had always favored the capture of her country. Most likely, Cleopatra crossed the sea on a warship accompanied by doctors, philosophers, eunuchs, seamstresses, cooks, not to mention baby Caesarion and his nurse. In addition, Cleopatra also brought expensive gifts: fabrics, cinnamon, tapestries, alabaster pots, gold cups, mosaics, and leopards, all in order to support the reputation and demonstrate the wealth of Egypt to the Romans. Caesar hospitably accommodated the guests in his estate across the Tiber, and they were honored with special treatment. In Caesar's mansion, Cleopatra was surrounded by many interesting people, such as the singer and musician Hermogenes, who was very fond of the queen. At the same time, in Rome, the queen had to face a problem familiar to any celebrity in a foreign country. She knew almost no one, but everyone knew her. Her visit began to irritate Caesar's wife, Calpurnia. The other Romans looked at Cleopatra with great curiosity. Knowing this, the queen tried to be in public as rarely as possible. Caesar visited the Egyptian woman in the villa, making no secret of his visits. He inaugurated the Forum of Julius in Rome. In addition to the crowded Roman Forum, the main decoration of which was the Temple of Mother Venus. A magnificent statue of Venus stood in it, and Caesar ordered a gilded statue of Cleopatra to be placed next to it. This generous gesture was an unheard of honor at the time. In Ptolemaic Egypt, it was a long-standing custom to erect statues of beloved kings in the temples of the gods. Caesar first spread this custom to Rome, and Cleopatra was the first to receive such an honor. When spring came and navigation resumed, Cleopatra went home, promising to return to Rome by the end of the year. She left Egypt without supervision for 18 months anyway. The journey from north to south was quite tiring, although not as much from south to north. The departure took place at the end of March. The beginning of April, at that time, the storms near the Egyptian coast subsided. The Roman dictator let his girlfriend go reluctantly, with unheard of honors and rich gifts. He recognized Caesarion and allowed Cleopatra to give the child his name. The Egyptian queen visited Rome again in the 45th year, by which time Caesar had already returned from Spain, and announced that the last supporters of Pompey had been overthrown and the civil war was over. The general settled in Rome, and his affair with Cleopatra continued despite public opinion. In February 44, Caesar was proclaimed a lifelong dictator. The general began a new grandiose military campaign, turning his attention to Partha, a country on the eastern border of Rome, which had so far resisted a powerful neighbor. The future separation could break Cleopatra's heart. The dictator complained about his health at the time, but Parthia opened the way to India for Rome. 55-year-old Caesar planned a campaign that promised to last at least 3 years. In the early spring of 44, the general sent 16 legions and most of the cavalry to Parthia, promising to lead them on the 18th of March. However, this plan never came true. "Gracious Emperor, I ask you to have mercy on my exiled brother. A scoundrel, what are you doing?" Caesar thought to defend himself, but in vain. Seeing that there was no escape, he covered his head with a toga, and having received 23 wounds, fell and died at the foot of the statue of Pompey. The attackers rushed away. Apart from Calpurnia, whose husband's mutilated body was brought to her house, no one in all of Rome was as shocked by what had happened as Cleopatra. For her, Caesar's death was not only a personal loss, but also a political catastrophe. The queen lost her main defender and could no longer feel safe. She was going to leave Rome in the middle of March. On March 17th, at the villa of Mark Antony, the favorite of the former emperor, Caesar's will was revealed and announced. Cleopatra was not mentioned in it, although she was in Rome in September when the dictator drew up the document. Caesar bequeathed the villa where Cleopatra lived and the land around it to the Roman people. Every adult man in the city received 75 drachmas. To everyone's surprise, Mark Antony was also left with nothing. His nephew, Gaius Octavian, was named Caesar's heir. Having officially adopted the boy, Caesar left him 3/4 of his fortune and his name. Antony was declared Octavian's guardian along with other close commanders, among whom were his murderers. Cleopatra was in the city during a terrible storm that broke out immediately after the funeral. A month after the murder, she finally left the villa. This time, the trip was especially difficult for Cleopatra. She was pregnant again, and by March, she could no longer hide her situation. The late dictator's pregnant girlfriend was a serious threat to the future of Rome. Unlike Caesarion, the second child was conceived on Roman soil. The whole city knew that this was Caesar's child. However, the queen was not destined to deliver it. Either while at sea or after returning home, she had a miscarriage. In sunny Alexandria, state affairs and solemn receptions, rituals, and ceremonies awaited Cleopatra. She never returned to Rome, although she continued to closely monitor what was happening there. But then alarming news came across the sea. The younger sister of the queen, Arsinoe, did not leave any claim to the throne even in exile. Burned with the desire to take revenge for the defeat of 4 years ago, she enlisted the support of Ephesus and declared herself the Queen of Egypt. At the disposal of Arsinoe were countless treasures at the Temple of Artemis and reliable allies in Rome. At the same time, there appeared an impostor that called himself Ptolemy XIII, who miraculously escaped from the waters of the Nile. The sisters hated each other. Arsinoe lured the commander of the Egyptian garrison in Cyprus to her side. Meanwhile, Cleopatra had another potential traitor, Ptolemy XIV. Cleopatra, who again found herself surrounded by enemies, firmly decided not to step on a rake again, and soon, Ptolemy was killed, most likely poisoned. His death allowed the queen to name her son as her co-ruler, which she did that same summer. In July, Caesarion was proclaimed Pharaoh. He was the third co-ruler of Cleopatra. From now on, her son was called King Ptolemy, aka Caesar, father-loving god. So, a 3-year-old Roman ascended the Egyptian throne, who could hardly prevent his mother's ambitions. Caesarion was revered as the embodiment of Horus, who took revenge on the murderers of his father. To perpetuate Caesar's memory, the queen ordered the construction of the Caesarium, a city within a city with many galleries, gazebos, avenues, and gardens of extraordinary beauty over the Alexandria harbor. At the beginning of the 40s, Cleopatra achieved a new milestone in her history. The queen took the first steps on the way to the revival of the former glory of the Ptolemies and succeeded in this much more than her father. She supported and increased the intellectual power of Alexandria, which she inherited. The queen gathered brilliant thinkers around her, invited famous scientists to the city, and gradually recreated the Greek intelligentsia. In Cleopatra's circle, there was a place for talented practitioners and authors of theoretical treatises. During her reign, Egyptian medicine achieved unprecedented success, especially in the treatment of eyes and lungs. Many decisive steps were taken in surgery as well. In her homeland, she had the fame of a versatile, educated, and talented woman. Her name is associated with achievements in medicine, hairdressing, cosmetics, etc. Among Cleopatra's inventions is an interesting remedy for baldness, a paste made of roasted mouse, burnt rag, burnt horse's teeth, bear fat, deer brain, and reed bark in equal parts. The ointment was supposed to be mixed with honey and rubbed into the head until the hair begins to grow. Information about Cleopatra's intelligence was gleaned from the Arab world, where Roman propaganda did not penetrate. In the East, she was famous as a philosopher, physiologist, scientist, and thinker. However, the queen's power was yet to pass the test of strength when misfortunes began to fall on Egypt. In the 43rd year, the Nile did not overflow, and there was almost no harvest. The same disaster happened a year later. The harvest at that time was the most miserable in history. Famine was approaching. Tumors and black ulcers began to appear in people. The plague entered Egypt. Then Cleopatra ordered the royal storehouses to be opened and corn to be distributed free of charge. Inflation was terrible, had to devalue gold coins. Beggars from 2 large provinces begged to be relieved of their tax burden. Filled with compassion, the queen ordered the abolition of taxes everywhere. To top off all troubles, in the 43rd year, the Roman Civil War reached Egyptian shores. Cleopatra was unwittingly involved in the confrontation between Caesar's favorite, Publius Cornelius Dolabella, and one of the participants in the conspiracy against him, Gaius Cassius Longinus. When Dolabella asked for her help, the queen sent him the 4 legions that Caesar had left in Alexandria and her fleet in addition, securing in return the promise that Caesarion would be recognized as the rightful ruler of Egypt. Unfortunately, Cleopatra's ships were caught by surprise in the open sea and fell to the enemy Cassius without a fight. Cassius was already asking Cleopatra for help. She found a reason to refuse. Famine and pestilence almost completely devastated the country. Sending an apology to Cassius, the queen secretly fitted out another flotilla for Dolabella, but the storm prevented the ships from leaving the harbor. Meanwhile, a mutiny broke out among Cleopatra's entourage. The commander of the Cypriot garrison refused to carry out her order and gave the Egyptian ships to Cassius. In July of the 43rd year, surrounded and defeated by Cassius, Dolabella took his own life. His place was taken by the old enemies of Cassius, Octavian and Mark Antony. After Caesar's death, they formed an alliance and vowed to take revenge on the murderers, especially Cassius and Brutus. The queen sent a powerful flotilla loaded with weapons and supplies to Caesar's nephew Octavian, and was even going to personally accompany her to Greece. After learning about this, Cassius began to threaten Cleopatra, but she did not succumb to provocations, instead continuing to support his opponents. Getting angry, Cassius decided to march on Egypt. The moment for this was the best. Famine was raging in the country, so the Roman legions left. Cleopatra later claimed that she was not at all afraid of Cassius, but in fact it would be foolish not to be afraid of him. He was a terrible man, cruel and greedy. So Cleopatra again found herself between 2 fires, and again, at the last moment, a wonderful rescue came. Cassius was already ready to go to Egypt, but then Octavian and Mark Antony crossed the Adriatic and marched east to meet the enemy. Cassius was confused. Brutus, with appropriate severity, reminded his associate that they were not fighting for power, but for the freedom of Rome. Disappointed, Cassius turned his troops back and left for Greece to join Brutus, but it was too early to rejoice. The Egyptian fleet hastened to join Octavian and Antony. Cleopatra was on board the flagship. Unfortunately, a storm intervened again, and the queen had to return to Alexandria with the remnants of the fleet. Cassius, who was about to lure the Egyptian fleet into a trap, found only its wreckage near the southern coast of Greece. Cleopatra was sick at that time, and it cost her incredible efforts not to make alliances with anyone. 10 months later, the army of Brutus and Cassius met Octavian and Antony on a wide plain in eastern Macedonia, near the city of Philippi. 2 heavy, bloody battles followed. One of the parties was going to establish a dictatorship in Rome, the other fought for the Republic. 2 huge armies of almost 100,000 men raised clouds of dust, rushed at each other. It was not until the end of the second battle that Octavian and Antony began to win. Cassius voluntarily passed away. Moreover, the dagger that he once stuck into Caesar helped him in this. Brutus rushed at the sword. Octavian ordered his corpse beheaded and his head sent to Rome. In the 42nd year, Octavian and Antony divided the Mediterranean between them. Having concluded the contract, they went in different directions. Antony bathed in the rays of well-deserved glory. Having won the battle, he went east to restore order and replenish the depleted treasury. Octavian was taken from the battlefield in a palanquin. He went west to improve his health. It was time to disband the army, pay the soldiers, and give them land. Avoiding direct participation in the war, the queen perfectly understood that she would have to answer for her choice, and very soon. Cleopatra herself would have preferred to stay away from Mark Antony, but the position of the colonial queen, friend and ally of Rome, obliged her to seek the favor of the winner. The entire East, in particular Egypt, was in Antony's power. After the victory at Philippi, it seemed that everything would be under the control of the new hero. His legions marched through Asia. In Athens, he was met by enthusiastic crowds. In Ephesus, he was revered as a god. Antony stopped at Pharsalus, the magnificent capital of Cilicia, on the southeastern coast of modern Turkey. There, to a flowering valley surrounded by the steep mountains of southern Asia, he called Cleopatra. But she was in no hurry to pay a visit, visiting the commander only at the end of summer. Cleopatra approached the assembly with particular care, as if she felt that she had to conquer not only Mark Antony, but also the whole world. The appearance of Cleopatra in Ephesus was in every sense stunning. The queen again had to cross 1,000 kilometers across the Mediterranean Sea, mooring for the night at the rocky Levantine shore. At the mouth of the Sind, Cleopatra and her retinue transferred to ornate boats to travel another 16 kilometers up the river. Usually, the royal flotilla was driven by 170 oarsmen, but this time it was decided to reduce their number by a third. The boats were followed by ships loaded with supplies. Venus hastens to be reunited with Bacchus for the good of all Asia. Antony responded to Cleopatra's greetings with an invitation to dinner. It was a matter of prestige to be the first to give lunch. Taking advantage of her position, the queen insisted that the Roman come to her and bring as many guests as he wished. She wanted to show that she did not come when called, but called herself. Strangely enough, Antony agreed, probably deciding not to offend the guest. That evening, as however, and in the following ones, Cleopatra ordered 12 banquet tables to be laid. They were adorned with elegant gold dishes decorated with precious stones. The queen did not miss the opportunity to appear before the guests in all her glory. Antony lost the ability to speak. Cleopatra smiled gently. After dinner, she announced that her guest is free to take as a present whatever he wishes, and invited him to come again the next day with his friends and relatives. It must be understood that Antony's private life was quite messy. Caesarion in his Philippics repeatedly noted his addiction to alcohol. In addition, he was extremely domineering, and this character trait gave him a reputation that suited him perfectly. As claimed by Antony's political enemies, he allegedly had same-sex relationships in his youth, but now he was interested only in women. As the same Plutarch wrote, weakness to the opposite sex shaded the attractive features of his character and even won him the sympathy of many people, since Antony often helped others in their love affairs and accepted with good nature their jokes about his own affairs of this kind. Showy luxury was a way to attract the attention of a person who needed money. The Roman treasury was empty, and Octavian and Antony had already promised each soldier 500 drachmas, that is the 12th part of a talent. Under their command were 30 legions. Furthermore, Caesar's successor was simply obliged to continue the Parthian campaign because the Parthians supported the conspirators. They encroached on other people's land and harassed their neighbors. Outstanding military successes in foreign territory were to strengthen Mark Antony's position at home. But the dream of Partha could not become a reality without the participation of Cleopatra, the only ruler capable of paying for this military adventure. So Mark Antony arranged a banquet for Cleopatra. Of course, the ambitious Roman wanted anything surpass the guest in splendor and wealth. Of course, he didn't succeed. The meeting in Pharsalus, despite Cleopatra's attempt to turn it into a colorful ceremony, very quickly turned into informal negotiations between the two rulers. The queen and Mark Antony had a lot in common. Both could not agree with Caesar's last will and did not want to recognize Octavian as his rightful heir. Cleopatra stayed in Pharsalus for only a few weeks, but it turned out to be quite enough. Antony disappeared once and for all. Just seeing her, Antony, who had already reached the age of 40, fell in love like a boy. It was profitable for Cleopatra to fall in love with a person on whom her fate depended, and for whom with a woman capable of providing for his army. The queen did not waste her time in vain. Going back, she took with her a significant set of important arrangements. First of all, she managed to have her sister Arsinoe removed from the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, where she met her death on its marble steps. So Cleopatra became the last of 5 siblings. There were no other claimants to the throne. The wise ruler promised to help her ally, but was in no hurry to fulfill her promise. The Asian kingdoms turned out to be poorer than Mark Antony had expected, and Egypt was a rich country. The Roman consul could legally visit conquered lands, especially on the eve of a major military campaign. Rome needed a navy, and Cleopatra's help was indispensable here. Otherwise, Antony risked forever remaining a ruler without a kingdom. Wanting to show respect to Cleopatra and fearing to repeat Caesar's mistake, Mark Antony left for Egypt without troops and servants. The queen gave the guest an elegant reception and tried to provide him with, quote, all the refined joys and noble entertainments for which her capital was famous. The banquet in the guest's honor started a long series of celebrations, games, and all kinds of fun. The queen tried to please Antony, not leaving him for a minute and completely abandoning important state affairs. The Alexandrians welcomed the Roman with open arms. Following their queen, they fell in love with the guest for his easy disposition and were ready to go through water and fire with him. The people who 7 years ago met Caesar with hostility surrendered to his self-proclaimed heir without a fight. Meanwhile, the vacation was ending. Sooner or later, it was necessary to return to the long-forgotten Rome. The guest celebrated his 43rd birthday in Alexandria and would probably visit again. However, the messages that came at the end of the winter were disappointing. There was disturbance in the east. The Parthians captured Syria and killed the governor who had just been appointed by Antony. No less alarming news came from the west about Antony's wife, Fulvia's reckless prank. She started a war against Octavian with the sole purpose of tearing her husband away from the Egyptian woman and forcing him to return home. In April, Antony finally moved against the Parthians, but in northern Syria he was overtaken by a plaintive letter from Fulvia. The message forced the commander to stop the trip and, at the head of the flotilla of 200 new ships, go to Greece. The meeting turned out to be fiery. Fulvia vainly asked her husband to enter into an alliance with Pompey's son, Sextus, in order to destroy the rival together. Antony did not want to hear anything. He signed the contract and was not going to break it. Having equipped a new fleet, Antony left for the Adriatic. After parting with him, Fulvia began to languish from longing and soon died. The cause of her death was unclear. In Alexandria, the news of the Roman woman's death did not particularly upset anyone. Antony was sincerely sad and blamed himself for what had happened. Fulvia's death brought peace. When the woman who was ready to lead the empire into a bloody war out of mere jealousy of Cleopatra was gone, Octavia and Antony immediately reconciled. However, Sextus Pompeius continued to rule the sea undividedly, not allowing Roman ships with grain to pass. Endless war ruined agriculture. Rome turned into a starving, ungovernable city on the brink of survival. Riots were brewing in the villages. The soldiers demanded that Antony distribute the funds grossed abroad. The 2 recent victors were forced to re-establish an alliance and divide the empire between them. And this time, Octavian was more generous. According to the agreement, Antony was to go to Parthia and Octavian was to deal with Sextus Pompeius. In addition, Octavian offered Antony to marry his beloved half-sister. Octavia had a great purpose. She served as a guarantee of the truce. At the end of December 40th BC, Antony and Octavia got married in Rome. The events of the 40th and 39th years did not surprise, but rather alarmed Cleopatra. And not Antony's wedding, but the contract with Octavian, who was her worst enemy, a walking threat to her son. However, the queen had time to study her beloved well and had no doubts. Antony would return. Cleopatra suspected that the truce between him and Octavian was very shaky and could end at any moment. And she was right. But what gave rise to the resumption of Antony's confrontation with Octavian? We will tell you in the second part. And to see it faster, click on like, subscribe, and write a comment in support of our channel. Biographer History was with you. See you in ancient Egypt very soon.